The auction started at 9 in the morning, and Opaline Cord was the only bidder. That is not a figure of speech. The folding chairs in the Harlan County Clerk's office had been arranged in 2 rows of 612 chairs total, and Opaline was sitting in one of them, and the other 11 were empty. The clerk, a man named Gerald who wore a bolo tie with a turquoise stone the size of a thumbnail, did not look at her once during the entire proceedings. He read the legal description from a laminated sheet in the flat, practiced voice of a man who had read the same words many times before and expected nothing unusual to come of them. Lot 9, Section 4, Harlan County Plat Records, 0.8 acres, County Road 7. Delinquent on taxes since 2019. Minimum bid $9. Opaline said $9. Gerald wrote something down. He looked at the empty chairs the way a person looks at something they have already accounted for. He asked if there were any other bids. There were not. He said sold, stamped something with a stamp that made a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence, and that was the auction. It took 4 minutes. She had $349 in her checking account at First Cumberland Bank. She wrote a check for $9, and Gerald gave her a receipt and told her the deed would be processed within 30 days. He said it the way you say something to someone you do not expect to see again, with the mild courtesy you extend to strangers passing through. Opaline folded the receipt and put it in the inside pocket of her grandfather's barn coat, olive canvas. The lining torn at the left shoulder, the smell of pine resin and machine oil still alive in the fabric after all the years he had worn it. She walked out into a February morning that was gray and still and not especially interested in what had just happened. Her truck was parked on Center Street, a 2003 Dodge Dakota dark green, 211,000 miles on the original engine. Her grandfather had left it to her specifically by name in a separate clause of his will. It was the only thing he had left her by name. Everything else, all 114 acres of coalfield farm, the equipment, the outbuildings, the cattle, the mineral rights, had gone to her brothers. She sat in the truck with the heat running and put her hand into the inside pocket alongside the receipt. Her fingers found what was already there, a single folded piece of paper line torn from a spiral notebook. Her grandfather's handwriting in soft pencil, a list of things that needed doing on the farm that coming spring. The list was unfinished. He had died before the season arrived, before the tasks on the page could be completed, before he could do the thing her grandmother had told Opaline he was planning to do, which was to call his attorney and revise the will. He had not called. The stroke had come on a Tuesday in November, and he had not called, and the will had remained as it was, and that was the fact of the matter. Opaline had read the list many times in the 2 months since his funeral. She nearly had it memorized. Check fence line along the north pasture. Order mineral supplement before April. Call about the hay baler belt. And at the bottom of the page below, the practical items written in the same careful hand, but with slightly more pressure, as if he had pressed harder to make sure it lasted. Ask Ondine about the land east of the culvert. And below that, so faint she had almost missed it. The first dozen times she had looked at the page, 2 words she had not understood until this morning. Watch Garnett. She sat with that for a moment. Then she put the truck in drive and headed toward County Road 7 to see what she had just bought. County Road 7 runs north out of Harlan for about 3 miles before the county stops maintaining it with any seriousness. Opaline had driven this stretch her whole life without paying it much attention. It was just the road between town and the farm, the road she had ridden as a child, with her face against the cold window glass, watching the ridgeline appear and disappear through the trees. She had never thought about who owned the scrubby fields on either side of it. They were just there. The way the mountains were just there, present and unexamined. The property was visible from the road once she knew what to look for. A cedar brake along the north edge, dense enough to block the wind, and behind it and beyond it, a solid mass of dormant blackberry cane that ran from the fence line on one side to the fence line on the other. Not a field with weeds at the edges. A wall, brown and dry and honest about its density in the February light, 4 feet high in most places, thick enough that you could not see the ground beneath it or know what the ground was doing. She pulled the Dakota off the road onto a strip of gravel and cut the engine and sat with her hands in her lap. The receipt was in her pocket. She had $340 left. She had never walked this land. She did not know its shape, its drainage, its soil, whether anything useful had ever grown on it or could. She had bought it because it was the only thing she could afford to buy, and because the morning she had sat in her rented room on Miners Creek Road and done the arithmetic on her remaining money, she had understood that money sitting still was money that would eventually be gone. She needed it to do something. She did not know yet if this was the right something. She got out and walked to the edge of what the county's official record now said was her property. The first thing she noticed was the quiet. The cedar break along the north edge absorbed the road noise almost immediately, and inside that quiet, the land had its own small sounds. A sparrow moving through dry brush somewhere in the cane. The slow tick of cedar branches touching each other in no wind she could feel. Her own boots on frozen ground, each step a small creak. The second thing she noticed was the fence. Cedar post original to something much older than anyone currently living in the county, and most of it was down. Not recently. The post had been weathering for years, graying at the surface, and the barbed wire had gone slack in most places, and in a few spots had worked itself half into the soil, tangled through with blackberry root systems, as if the land had quietly incorporated it into itself over the long years it had been left alone. She walked the perimeter. She could do that because the edges along the road and the fence lines had been kept mowed by the county crew over the years, just enough to mark the boundary without any real interest in what lay beyond it. She carried her notebook, a plain composition book she had bought at the dollar store in town the week before, and she wrote as she walked. Corner post still standing northeast. 3 rails of old fence on the western edge intact. She stopped in the southeast corner, where there was a gap in the blackberry canopy, a place where a tree that had fallen and rotted maybe, or a section of heavier soil that had kept the canes lower, opened up enough to show actual ground. Dark ground. Darker than the soil along the road, darker than she expected. She wrote dark corner NE, investigate. She continued along the western edge and stopped again at a depression in the earth roughly 8 feet across, subtle enough that she almost stepped into it rather than seeing it. The blackberry grew right up to its rim and then stopped, which was its own kind of signal, though she did not know what kind yet. The depression was about 18 inches deep at its lowest point, and the bottom held a little standing water from rain earlier in the week. She wrote low spot west edge, drainage or something else. She was standing back at the truck reading over her notes when she heard the fence wire shift. Not a break, just a sound the kind a post makes when weight leans against it. She turned. There was a woman standing at the property line on the other side of what remained of a 3-strand wire fence separating Opaline's lot from the parcel to the north. She was older, past 70 by a ways, wearing a brown canvas coat with a corduroy collar, and she was holding a green thermos in one hand. She was not looking at Opaline. She was looking at the land, at the blackberry mass of it, with an expression that was not exactly recognition, but was close to it. Something remembered. Opaline walked towards her. The woman waited. She did not introduce herself. She just held out the thermos. "You look cold," she said. Opaline was. She took the thermos and drank 2 swallows of black coffee that was very hot and tasted like it had been made in a percolator. She handed it back. The woman poured herself a capful, and they stood on either side of the wire fence without talking for a moment, while a crow crossed the field from west to east, and they both watched it go. Then the woman said, without looking at Opaline, without being asked, "Eunice Vestal used to grow the best pole beans in this county off that little piece." Opaline did not say anything. She waited. Planted them along the eastern edge. Had a trellis system she built herself. Cedar posts and baling wire. You could not buy beans like that at the market. People used to ask her where she got her seed. She took a sip from the cap. She would just smile, the woman said. Never told a soul. Opaline asked how long ago. The woman thought about it. Last time I saw her garden running full was maybe 71, 72. She slowed down after that. Her knees, she passed in 87. Property has been sitting since. 36 years of blackberry cane accumulating on top of whatever Eunice Vestal had built. The woman said her name was Ondine Caswell. She lived on the parcel to the north, had for 43 years since she married. She had known Eunice toward the end of her gardening years. They used to trade seeds across this same fence line. She said the same wire, the same posts. Then Ondine looked at Opaline directly for the first time. "Your grandfather used to stop by now and then," she said. "Elton. We talked about this piece sometimes. He knew about Eunice." Opaline felt something shift in her chest, a small movement like something settling into place. She reached into the inside pocket of the barn coat and took out the folded piece of notebook paper. She held it over the fence without a word. Ondine took it and looked at it. Her eyes moved slowly down the list. When she reached the bottom, she read the last 2 lines and was quiet for a moment. "He wrote that down," Ondine said finally. She looked up. "I did not know he had written it down. I thought it was just something we talked about." "You know what it means," Opaline said. It was not a question. Ondine folded the paper carefully and handed it back. She looked out at the land. Your grandfather knew about something on this property, she said. Something Eunice left behind. She told him about it herself toward the end. He was one of the few people she trusted with it. He talked to me about it once, said if the land ever went to the right person, he hoped they would find it. He said he hoped that person might be family. She picked up the thermos. As for Garnet, Ondine said, that is a different story, and you will need to know it. But not today. Today you should walk the land. Come by Tuesday, and I will give you something you are going to need. She turned back toward her property without ceremony. Opaline stood at the fence a long time after Ondine disappeared into the tree line, holding her grandfather's list in one hand and looking at the blackberry wall in front of her. He had known about this piece of ground and about whatever was on it, and he had written those 2 lines at the bottom of a list of farm tasks in soft pencil, as if they were just 2 more things to be done, just 2 more items on the page because maybe he had not expected to run out of time before he got to them. She put the paper back in her pocket. She looked at the land. Then she got in the truck and drove back to her room on Miners Creek Road to figure out how she was going to clear 8/10 of an acre by herself in February. Ondine gave her the broad fork on Tuesday as promised. She handed it over the fence post without ceremony. 2 tines worn wooden handles, the steel darkened from decades of use, and said only what she said about the soil. It does not want to be broken. It wants to be opened. You will feel the difference. Opaline carried the broad fork back to the lot and set it against the tailgate of the Dakota and stood there looking at what she had bought. The brush mower came 4 days later. She found it on a local selling site online, a DR model loaded into the bed of a neighbor's truck by the man she bought it from. $85 cash. He threw in a spare belt. It started on the 3rd pull, and she ran it for 6 hours on the first day, moving back and forth across the eastern third of the lot, stopping every 20 minutes to clear wrapped cane from the blade housing with a stick she kept tucked in her back pocket for the purpose. The blackberry came out in mats. The cedar scrub was younger than it looked, the root systems shallow enough that she could lever them free with the broad fork once the mower knocked them down. She worked from first light until she could no longer trust her footing in the fading afternoon. She did not count the hours. She counted the rows. The cold was the particular February cold of that part of Kentucky, the kind that sits in the air without any wind behind it and feels almost polite about how much it is asking of you. She wore her grandfather's coat every day. The torn lining at the left shoulder let cold air find her back if she held her arm up too long, and she learned quickly to adjust to compensate to keep moving. By the 2nd week, she had reached the center of the lot. By the 3rd week, she had pushed into the northwest corner where the cedar was thickest, and the ground dropped away in a way she had not been able to see from the road. The slope was subtle, maybe 8 inches across 15 feet, but it was consistent, and the soil there was darker than anywhere else she had turned. Dense, almost black, the kind of color that in this part of the country does not happen without reason. She was clearing the last of a cedar cluster in that northwest corner when the mower's front wheel dropped. Not much, 4 inches, maybe 5. But the frame tilted and she cut the engine by instinct and knelt down and pulled back a curtain of cane root with her gloved hands and found the edge of something. A timber rotted almost to fiber running parallel to the ground at a slight angle downward. The wood was so far gone, it crumbled when she pressed it with her thumb. But the shape of it was still readable. A frame. Something with a frame. She cleared it by hand after that an hour with the mattock, another 30 minutes pulling root with her fingers inside the gloves. What emerged was a depression roughly 8 feet by 5, its perimeter lined with stacked fieldstone, the stones fit together without mortar, set by someone who knew what they were doing with their hands. The timber had been a door frame. The door itself had collapsed inward and rotted nearly flat into the soil. The ghost of its planks pressed into the dark earth like a photograph of something that used to exist. A root cellar. Hand-dug, hand-lined, probably dug before anyone in her family was born, before the county road had been paved, before most of what surrounded it now had been built. She stood at the edge and looked down into the dark for a moment. The smell that came up was cold and mineral and airless, the way a place smells when nothing has breathed inside it for a very long time. She climbed down, carefully testing each stone with her boot before she trusted it. The walls were solid. The fieldstone had held. At the bottom, the floor was hard-packed earth, and the space was larger than she had expected from above, maybe 6 feet of headroom at the center, and she stood in it with her arms at her sides and let her eyes adjust. That was when she saw the box. It was in the far corner, set on a flat stone, that had been placed there deliberately to keep it off the ground. Olive drab military issue, roughly the size of a shoebox, but heavier when she lifted it. The latch was a swing bale, the kind that locks down over a steel loop. The rubber gasket seal had held through all the years and all the weather above. It had held through the door rotting and the blackberry colonizing and the county mowing the edges and not looking at what was inside. She could feel the seal resist when she worked the latch free. A small sigh of pressure releasing the way a mason jar sounds when the seal finally gives. Inside was dry. Everything inside was dry. She carried it up out of the cellar and set it in the truck bed and sat with it for a moment, not opening it, just sitting with the gray February afternoon going amber around her at the edges. Then she drove to Ondine's. Ondine opened the door before Opaline finished knocking the way people do when they have heard a vehicle on their gravel and already know who it is. She put water on for coffee without asking. Opaline set the box on the kitchen table, which was covered in a yellow oilcloth, worn white at the corners, from years of elbows and meals, and she opened it there under the overhead light. A folded canvas pouch. Inside the pouch, a small hand-forged trowel with 2 letters scratched into the metal near the base. EV. Below the pouch, a notebook. Composition style, its cover water-stained but intact. The pages inside dry and legible, the edges only slightly darkened with age. And beneath the notebook, a small paper envelope folded flat. The kind seed companies once sold individual varieties in a long time ago, when you could walk into a hardware store and buy a single packet of something specific. Ondine sat across from Opaline and reached out and touched the cover of the notebook before Opaline opened it. Just her fingertips. The way you touch someone's shoulder when you want them to know you are present. The first entry was dated April 3, 1951. The handwriting was small and controlled, more precise than Opaline had expected, laid out almost in columns. A date, a description of what had been amended, and where a note of what came up and what did not. Eunice Vestal had kept records the way a scientist keeps records, methodical and without sentimentality. 20 years of entries going from 1951 through 1971, season by season, without a gap. Opaline read slowly. Ondine read alongside her, leaning over the table. On page 41, in the middle of the 1959 entries, a notation had been underlined twice with a steady hand. The dark corner never fails. Deep black to 18 inches at minimum. Always first to drain, never waterlogged. Below it, a rough sketch in pencil, a rectangle divided into 4 quadrants. The marked corner was northeast. Opaline looked at Ondine. Ondine looked at the page. "That sounds exactly right," Ondine said. Eunice used to call that corner her insurance. She never explained why it was different from the rest. She just knew that it was, and she worked it accordingly. Opaline picked up the seed envelope then. It had writing on the outside in pencil faded to near nothing. Ondine took it and held it under the overhead light and read it without needing her glasses, which surprised Opaline. "Zinnias," Ondine said. She set the envelope down carefully on the oilcloth. Eunice spent years developing them, selecting seed every fall crossing for color and stem length. She never sold this variety or shared it outside the boundaries of her own land. Opaline tilted the envelope. She could feel the seeds shift inside, dry and small and light, older than she was by more than 30 years. Then Ondine said the thing she had not said yet, the thing she had been holding back, and her voice when she said it was quiet and deliberate. "Your grandfather knew about this box," she said. Eunice told him herself. He was the only person outside of me that she trusted with the knowledge of it. He came to me after she told him, and we talked about what it meant, and he said that if the land ever found its way to the right person, he hoped they would know what to do with what was inside. He said he hoped that person might be from his own family someday. He just did not know how to make that happen. She looked at the barn coat hanging on Opaline's chair. "I think he did the best he could," Ondine said, "with what time he had left and what he had available to him." Opaline sat with that for a long moment. The overhead light was steady, the water had boiled, and Ondine had made coffee without Opaline noticing, and now there was a mug beside her elbow still steaming. Her grandfather had not left her Coalfield farm. He had not been able to, but he had left her his coat and his truck and a list with 2 lines at the bottom, and those 2 lines had brought her here to this table, to this notebook, to a box that a woman named Eunice Vestal had sealed and placed on a flat stone in a root cellar, entrusted to outlast her by whatever years were necessary. There was one more thing Opaline told Ondine then. She told her about Harwick Garnett, The man who had come to the property 3 days after the auction. The Silverado and the fleece jacket, and the offer of $400 delivered in the tone of someone doing her a favor by taking something inconvenient off her hands. She told Ondine what he had said about drainage problems, about the land becoming a swamp in wet season, about the investment not being worth her time. Ondine listened without interrupting. When Opaline finished, Ondine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Garnett has wanted that land since before you came to Harlan. He did not come to the auction because he was certain no one else would bid, and he planned to approach the county afterward about a private arrangement. He has been waiting on that piece of ground for longer than you have been alive, and he knows things about it that he has no intention of telling you." She poured more coffee into her own mug. "There was a dispute once," Ondine said, "years ago, between Garnett's father and Eunice, over the western edge of her property. Eunice had something on that land, something underground that affected the drainage of the land next to hers. Garnett's father knew it and wanted control of it. Eunice never gave it to him. When she died, the land sat, and the Garnetts assumed they would eventually get what they wanted through patience. And then you walked into that auction and sat down in an empty room and said $9. Opaline looked at her notebook at the entry she had made weeks ago on the day she first walked the property. Low spot west edge, drainage or something else. She had written that before she knew anything. She had written it because something about the land had told her to look more closely. She drove back to her room on Miners Creek Road after dark, the box on the passenger seat, the notebook inside it. The mountains sat behind everything the way they always do in that part of Kentucky, present and patient, and not offering anything for free. In her room, she opened the notebook again and read the underlined entry from 1959 one more time. The dark corner never fails, deep black to 18 inches at minimum. Always first to drain, never waterlogged. Eunice had not explained why. She had only recorded what she observed year after year, the same result, the same notation. Whatever she had understood about the mechanics of it, she had kept in her head, and that understanding had gone with her in 1987. But the land had kept the record in its own way, in its soil, in its drainage, in the dark color that had surprised Opaline the first day she walked the perimeter and wrote "investigate." She put the notebook down and looked at her grandfather's barn coat hanging on the back of the door. She thought about him stopping at Ondine's fence line, talking to a woman named Eunice Vestal about a piece of ground on County Road 7, learning something he kept to himself for years, writing 2 lines at the bottom of a list of spring farm tasks with slightly more pressure than the lines above them, as if he knew those 2 lines needed to last. He had done what he could, with what time he had left and what he had available to him. She was going to have to do the same. 2 months earlier, she had stood in the kitchen of Coalfield Farm and listened to Sheldon lay out her options. He did not say any of it unkindly. That was always the thing about Sheldon. He leaned against the counter with his coffee, and he laid it out the way you lay out a budget. The farm was his and Theron's. That was just the fact of the will, and they were going to run it together, and there was work that needed doing. Always was. And if Opaline wanted to stay on and help with the chickens and the garden and some of the lighter field work, there would be a room for her and her name on a small monthly allowance, and everyone would get along fine. He said the word help 3 times in 2 sentences. She counted. She asked what the allowance would be. He said $200 a month. He said it the way a person says something they expect to be accepted without discussion. She looked at him across the kitchen. Their grandfather's kitchen, the same linoleum, the same row of coat hooks beside the back door. Their grandfather's barn coat still hanging on the 3rd hook from the left. And she understood that this was not a negotiation. This was a notification. She asked Sheldon one question before she left. She told him that their grandmother had said Elton intended to revise the will before the stroke took him, that he had already scheduled the appointment. She asked Sheldon if he knew that. Sheldon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he did not make it to that appointment. That is the only fact that matters legally. He was not wrong. That was the part that made it so difficult to answer. Theron was standing near the window the whole time. He did not say anything. He did not look at her when Sheldon was speaking. He looked at the window at the gray November morning outside it, and when she picked up her bag to go, he moved toward the door like he might say something. And then he stopped, and then he said, "Do you need gas money?" She said no. She left. 4 days later, she took the Dakota, which was hers outright, in a duffel bag, and her notebooks, and the cast-iron skillet her grandmother had used until her hands got too stiff to lift it. She rented a room on Miners Creek Road from a woman named Emmeline Pollard, $60 a week. Her grandfather's small insurance bequest, the money he had left her separately from the farm, had been $820. By February 14th, it had become $349, and she had just spent 9 of it on a piece of land nobody else wanted. The thing that stayed with her driving out on County Road 7 that first morning was not anger. It had been anger at first, the first week after the kitchen conversation, but anger is expensive, and she had learned quickly that she could not afford it. What she had by February was something quieter and more useful, a kind of patience with a hard edge to it, the patience of someone who has looked at a problem from enough angles to know which direction to push. The land was the direction she had chosen. The garlic went into the ground on the first Saturday of March before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. Opaline had been awake since 5. Not because she had set an alarm, but because the room on Miners Creek Road was cold, in the way rented rooms are cold when the landlord keeps the thermostat low overnight, a chill that settles into the joints and makes staying still impossible. She dressed in the dark, pulled on her grandfather's coat, and drove out to County Road 7 with the seat of the Dakota still cold beneath her. She had bought 4 pounds of hardneck seed garlic from Harlan Farm and feed on Pine Mountain Street, $8 a pound, $32 total. She had the broad fork Ondine had lent her propped in the truck bed alongside the seed garlic wrapped in burlap, and she stood at the edge of the northeast corner in the early gray light and pushed the broad fork into the earth for the first time. The tines went in clean and deep. The soil opened along the full length of the fork without resistance, without the grating sensation of hitting packed clay. She worked her way down the first row, pushing and rocking and lifting, and what came up was dark and loose and smelled alive in the cold air. She worked the corner section fully before moving to the western edge near the fence line, where the broad fork told its own story. 8 inches of workable soil, then resistance, then the gray of clay beneath. This was the difference Eunice had recorded for 20 years. The northeast corner held depth and drainage together in a way the rest of the lot could not match. Opaline did not yet know the mechanical reason for it, but she could feel it in the fork and the way the soil gave without argument, and she planted accordingly. She planted the garlic 6 inches apart in rows covered, each one marked the end of each row with a cedar stick she had cut herself from the brush she had already cleared. She had 63 posts by the second week of March, rough and uneven, but sound-driven with a borrowed post maul that left her palms bruised for 4 days after. On the morning she finished planting, she stood at the northeast corner and looked at the rows. The ground was marked and even and still cold enough that her boot prints held their shape. She thought about Eunice Vestal pressing seed into this same soil in the springs of the 1950s, writing down what came up and what did not, adjusting, persisting. Watching this particular corner outperform every other section of the lot season after season, and writing the same notation year after year. The dark corner never fails. Whatever Eunice had understood about why that was true, she had carried that knowledge with her when she went. Opaline was going to have to find it herself. The fencing was slow. The southern boundary had an irregular jog in the property line that did not match any obvious landmark, and she walked it 3 times with the plat map from the county before she trusted her stakes. By the end of March, she had 3 sides fenced with salvaged woven wire she had found rolled against the back wall of the collapsed shed on the lot itself. Old wire stiff with surface rust, but the gauge was heavy and it held tension without breaking. The coop she built the week before the hens arrived from scrap lumber out of the same shed rough work, but square enough with a hardware cloth window and a latch that actually caught. She drove down to Cumberland on a Tuesday and came back with 6 buff Orpington pullets in a cardboard box that shifted and complained the whole 40 minutes on Route 119. $8 each. She put them in at dusk and they settled almost immediately, moving into the corners of the coop in the slow, deliberate way of animals that are deciding whether a new place is safe. She opened her notebook that night at the table in her rented room and wrote out every number from the previous 6 weeks. The garlic, $32, wire staples and gate hardware, $19, the pullets, $48. Her balance at First Cumberland Bank was negative $55. She had borrowed a month of rent from Emmeline Pollard, who had not asked for an explanation and had not charged interest and had simply written the amount in a small ledger she kept by the telephone. Opaline looked at the negative number for a while. Then she opened Eunice's notebook and turned to a random page, not looking for anything in particular, just reading. She found a midsummer entry from 1956. 3 weeks of rain. Lost half the west rows. Replanted. Time-consuming, but the ground is still here. 5 words at the end. She read them twice, closed both notebooks, and went to sleep. 2 days later, Emmeline Pollard knocked on her door after supper. She stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, not unkindly, but with the directness of a woman who had reached an age where she had stopped finding ways around the things she wanted to say. "I saw the Coalfield Farm truck parked out on the road this afternoon," Emmeline said. "One of your brothers." Opaline said she knew. "I have known your family a long time," Emmeline said. "Your grandfather was a careful man, not the kind of man who left things unfinished by choice." She paused. "I do not know what happened with the will. It is not my business. But I know Elton Cord did not intend for things to end up the way they ended up. Whatever he was trying to set right before he died, he ran out of time to do it properly." She looked at Opaline the way older women sometimes look at younger ones, with an assessment that is not unkind, but does not offer false comfort either. "You are working that piece on County Road 7, she said. "Yes, ma'am." Emmeline nodded once. She said nothing more about the money Opaline owed her. She turned and went back down the hall, and Opaline stood in the doorway listening to her footsteps until they stopped. She thought about that for a long time after the door was closed. Her grandfather had been a careful man. He had been the kind of person who kept his equipment maintained, and his fence lines walked, and his records organized. He had not been careless with the will. Something had gotten in the way of what he intended, and he had run out of time to correct it. And the 2 lines at the bottom of a spring task list were the best he had been able to do with the hours he had left. She was going to have to be worth that. Harwick Garnett came back in the middle of March. He did not come alone this time. He arrived in the same white Silverado, but there was a younger man in the passenger seat who climbed out carrying a clipboard with papers clamped to it. He was dressed in clothes that were clean in a way that suggested he did not regularly work outdoors. He did not introduce himself. Garnett walked to the edge of the property with the ease of a man on familiar ground. He told Opaline he had done some research since their last conversation. He said he had pulled the original plat maps from 1947 and that there appeared to be an ambiguity in the western boundary of her lot, that the actual legal line might run 3 to 4 feet further east than the current fence suggested, which would place part of what she was treating as her property technically within his. He said it the way a person says something that they want to sound like a neutral observation. He said it was not an accusation. He said it was a courtesy notice. He said if it needed to be resolved through formal channels, that process could be time-consuming and expensive. Opaline looked at the younger man with the clipboard. She asked him what firm he was with. He named a company based in Lexington. She asked him why a surveying company from Lexington had sent someone to Harlan County to assess a boundary dispute without first filing a formal notice of claim with the county clerk's office. The younger man looked at Garnett. Garnett said this was an informal conversation. Opaline said, "If you have a legal claim, you know where the county clerk's office is. Right now you are standing on my land without an invitation." She said it without raising her voice. She said it the way she had learned to say things that needed to be said without spending more energy on them than they deserved. Garnett looked at her for a moment, not with anger, with the recalibrating expression of a man who had expected less pushback and was adjusting his estimate of what he was dealing with. Then he nodded, told the younger man they were done here, and walked back to the Silverado. The younger man followed without speaking. Opaline watched the truck pull out onto County Road 7 and disappear around the bend. Then she picked up the Broad Fork and went back to work. That evening she walked to Ondine's and told her what had happened. Ondine sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea and listened without interrupting. When Opaline finished, Ondine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He is not going to file anything. A real legal claim requires real documentation, and his documentation does not say what he says it says. I know because Eunice fought the same argument with his father 40 years ago, and she won. The plat maps are clear. Garnett knows that. What he is doing is trying to make you feel uncertain enough to sell before you find out how little ground he actually has to stand on." She set her cup down. "The thing he is actually worried about," Ondine said, "is underground. On the western edge of your property. Eunice had something there. Something she built that affects the drainage of the land next to yours. His land. He has wanted control of it for longer than you have been alive, and he still does not have it, and that makes him a man who is willing to be dishonest about surveys." Opaline thought about the depression she had noted on the first day. The entry in her notebook, "low spot west edge," drainage or something else. She had not followed it yet. She had been too busy with the clearing and the fencing and the planting. But Garnett had come back, and he had brought someone, with a clipboard, and whatever was on the western edge of her property was worth enough to him that he was willing to spend money on the performance of a legal threat he did not actually have. She went home and looked at the entry again and wrote one word beneath it: find it. She found it in the middle of May. 2 days of rain had softened the ground to the right depth, and she worked the western edge with a length of half-inch rebar she had sharpened to a rough point at one end left over from the fencing. She pushed it down every 2 feet and listened and felt for what it struck. Mostly it found soft soil, then clay, then resistance that meant bedrock. But about 18 inches in from the western fence line, the rebar found something different. Not clay, not stone. A give and then a stop that had a hollow quality to it, a sound she felt more than heard through the metal in her hands. She probed the same line north and south and found the same thing at the same depth running in a straight line. She got a shovel. 14 inches down, she struck fired clay tile. Old agricultural drainage, 4-inch diameter sections fitted together with a simple socket joint. The kind of drainage infrastructure that was laid by hand before machinery made it faster and cheaper to do it badly. She cleared a 2-foot stretch and could see that it was still seated, still intact, still moving water, the way it had been designed to move it quietly, invisibly, below the frost line, in the direction of least resistance. She sat back on her heels in the wet soil and understood what she was looking at. Someone had laid this drainage system before Opaline was born, before her grandfather was middle-aged, and it had been pulling excess moisture away from the northeast corner and distributing it at the right depth ever since. This was why Eunice's dark corner never failed. Not magic, not accident, engineering quiet and invisible and built to last. And the drainage tile did not stop at the property line. Opaline followed the line as far as she could trace it, and where the tile turned south, it ran directly under the fence and continued onto the parcel to the south, onto Garnett's land. She sat with that information for a long time. Garnett knew this system was here. He had known it, or his father had known it, and passed the knowledge down because this infrastructure affected the drainage behavior of his own property. If Opaline controlled the head end of this system, she had a form of leverage over the land adjacent to hers that had nothing to do with money or acreage or the size of her operation. It was not a weapon, but it was a fact, and Garnett had been trying to make her leave before she discovered it. She walked back to the truck and wrote in her notebook, "Tile drain confirmed west edge. Runs under fence into Garnett's parcel." He knew. Then she drove to town and had dinner and went to bed and did not think about Garnett again for several weeks because there was too much else to do. The tomato transplant she had started indoors in April. 2 trays of seedlings under a shop light she had borrowed and not returned went into the ground in late April along the south edge of the cleared area. Green beans along the eastern fence. Summer squash in the center rows. She had learned by then how the light moved across the lot at different hours and which sections got the longest direct sun, and she planted accordingly without reference to any book or guide, just by watching and adjusting. The hens had made themselves useful. They worked the ground near the perimeter of the lot in the slow, deliberate circuit that chickens make when left to their own judgment, and where they worked the soil was looser and richer with what they left behind. She had not planned this. She had bought them because she needed eggs, and because 6 birds at $8 each was $48 she could justify. But they were doing something she had not accounted for, and she wrote it down. By late June, the lot had begun to look like something with intention behind it. You could see it from the road. Opaline noticed the difference one morning when she arrived and looked back toward the county road before walking in, and where there had been a wall of brown cane, there was now a fenced rectangle with straight rows visible inside it, and a coop in the far corner, and a water line running from a tank she had set up on a raised platform at the north end. It was still small. It was still 0.8 of an acre, but it looked like a decision someone had made and was standing behind. She was on her knees pulling purslane from between the bean rows on a Thursday afternoon in late June when she heard the engine. She recognized the sound before she looked up. The Ram diesel from Coalfield Farm, dark gray, with the magnetic sign on the door that Theron had designed 2 summers ago. Sheldon pulled to the shoulder and left it running. He leaned out the window and looked at the lot the way a person looks at something that has surprised them against their better judgment. He looked at the fence. He looked at the tomato cages. He looked at the 6 hens working the far corner. Then he looked at Opaline. She stood up and waited. He said it looked like a lot of work for a small piece of ground. She said it was. He said he had been talking with Theron, said they had been thinking that if she wanted to get out from under the investment, they could probably work something out. Fold the lot into the farm boundary. Give her something fair for what she had put in. She asked him whose idea it was, his or Theron's. Both of us, he said. She asked what fair looked like to them, since the last number they had put to her time was $200 a month. Sheldon looked at the field again and did not answer that directly. He said he was not trying to be funny about it. He said he was being practical. Said the lot did not have the infrastructure for a real operation, and she would be better positioned to build something if she was not stretched so thin. He meant it. That was the thing about Sheldon. He almost always meant what he said. That had never been the problem. The problem was that he could mean something and still be wrong about it, and the two things did not cancel each other out. She told him she was not looking to sell. He nodded like he had expected that, but had to ask anyway. He looked at the field one more time and said she had done a decent job clearing it. Then he asked if she needed anything. She said no. He put the truck in gear and pulled out onto County Road 7 and was gone. Theron had not been in the truck. She had looked. The passenger seat was empty. From her porch across the fence line, Ondine had watched the whole thing without moving from her chair. She had a glass of something cold, and she was shelling the last of her June peas into a bowl in her lap. When Sheldon's truck disappeared around the bend, she took a long sip and set the glass on the porch rail and did not say anything. Opaline did not say anything either. Some things do not need commentary. He had come, he had looked, he had offered her a smaller version of what she already had, and she had said no. The field was still the field. She finished the row before the light changed. That night, Emmeline Pollard knocked again. Opaline opened the door, and Emmeline stood in the hallway the same way she had stood the last time, arms crossed direct. "I saw your brother's truck again today," she said. Opaline said she knew. Emmeline looked at her for a moment. She said, "Your grandfather came to me once, maybe 3 years before he died. He sat at my kitchen table and had coffee, and he told me something about that piece of land on County Road 7. He said there was a woman who had worked that land for 20 years and built something on it that most people would never notice or understand. He said he was trying to figure out how to make sure it ended up with someone who would." She uncrossed her arms. "He said he was running out of ways to do it through the will," she said. "He said he had a backup plan. I did not ask him what it was. But I think you are it." She turned and went back down the hall. Opaline stood in the doorway with the sound of Emmeline's footsteps fading, the low sound of the television from another room, the dark hallway and the single overhead bulb, and she understood something she had not let herself think directly before. Her grandfather had not just written 2 lines at the bottom of a list. He had talked to Ondine. He had talked to Emmeline. He had thought about this for years, and he had done what he could with what he had available. The will had not gone the way he intended, and he had known it might not, and so he had prepared a different path, a quieter one made of conversations and knowledge, and a sealed box in a root cellar, and he had trusted that someone would follow it. She had followed it without knowing that was what she was doing. Harwick Garnett came back for the 3rd time in early August. He came alone. He stood at the edge of the lot and waited for her to walk over, and when she did, he offered $1,200. 3 times his first offer. He said the ground was good. He could see that now he was not going to pretend otherwise, but that it was still not large enough to sustain a real operation long-term, and she was a young woman with better options ahead of her. She put her hand in the pocket of the barn coat, not as a gesture of any kind, just the way you put your hand in your pocket when you are thinking. She told him she had found the drainage tile on the western edge of the property. She told him she had traced it to the property line and that it continued onto his parcel. She told him that the tile drain originated on the Vestal lot, that it had been built by Eunice Vestal and was part of what made this ground what it was, and that he had known it was there long before she ever walked into that auction room. She said it calmly. She said it without any particular emphasis, the way you state a fact that does not need decoration. Garnett looked at her differently then, not with anger, with the expression of a man doing rapid arithmetic in his head and not liking where the numbers were landing. She said she was not threatening him. She said she simply wanted him to understand what the land was so that he could stop offering her money for something she had no intention of selling. He stood there another moment. Then he turned and walked back to the Silverado without saying anything, and he did not leave a business card this time. Opaline watched the truck go. Her hands were not entirely steady, not because she was afraid, because she had said something she was not completely certain she could back up with every legal detail in order, and Garnett did not know where the edge of her certainty was, and that uncertainty was the only real card she had played. But he had folded anyway. She turned back to the beans. By the first week of August, the northeast corner was so heavy with green beans that Opaline was picking every other morning just to keep the plants from going woody. She worked the rows before 7 while the dew was still on the leaves, 2 5-gallon buckets filled before the sun had cleared the ridgeline. Then the squash laid in crates in the truck bed. Then the tomatoes, the brandywines she had started on the windowsill in April, coming in cracked and warm from the vine. Some of them so heavy they pulled the cage wire down with them. She kept a running count in her notebook. Not because she doubted the harvest, but because Eunice had kept count, and it seemed like the right way to honor that. The first Saturday she drove to the Harlan County Farmers Market on Central Street. She had priced her produce at what she believed it was worth and loaded the truck accordingly. She set up her table in the early morning light, the tomatoes in rows, the beans in brown paper bags she had folded herself, the squash arranged with the stems facing the same direction, because it looked better that way, and she wanted it to look like she knew what she was doing. She sold $89 worth before noon. An older woman bought 3 pounds of tomatoes, walked halfway to her car, and came back for 2 more pounds. She said they tasted like the ones her mother used to grow before everything went to grocery stores, and everything in grocery stores started tasting the same. She said it without sentimentality as a statement of fact, and Opaline thanked her and made change from a cash envelope and watched her go. She drove back to Miners Creek Road that afternoon with an empty truck bed and $89, and her hands not entirely steady on the wheel. Not from exhaustion. From something she did not have a word for yet, the particular feeling of something you built yourself holding weight for the first time. She went back 4 Saturdays in August and 4 more in September. The notebook filled in its methodical way, date and crop and weight and price in total. The zinnias had come up along the fence row in early September, later than the seed packet would have suggested. But the seeds in Eunice's envelope were more than 50 years old, and she had not expected them to do anything at all. When the first shoots appeared, she had not known what they were for a few days, had almost pulled them thinking they were something else, and then recognized the leaf shape from a photograph in a library book she had checked out weeks earlier, on a hunch. They grew slowly and then all at once, the way some things do, and when the first buds opened in the second week of September, she went to check on them in the early morning and stopped at the edge of the row and just looked. The color was not red, it was not orange. It was something that sat between fire and the color of old pottery, a deep coral that did not have a clean name in English or anywhere else she could think of. The kind of color you see once and cannot afterward fully describe to someone who has not seen it. The stems were long and straight, and the heads were full and symmetrical and open completely. Eunice had spent decades on this, selecting the best seed from the best plant every fall, refining towards something specific, and the something specific was this color, this stem length, this form. And she had sealed the seed in a paper envelope and trusted it to 52 years of darkness. And it had worked. Ondine came to the fence the morning the zinnias opened and stood without speaking for a long time. She had a coffee cup in both hands, and she looked at the row of coral blooms along the fence line with an expression Opaline could only describe as confirmation. Not surprise. Confirmation. She had known what color they would be. She had seen this before. Long ago at a fence line that used to be the same fence line, this one had been built to replace. Opaline asked her. Ondine said she had seen them once many years ago when she was newly married and new to the property, and Eunice had still been gardening. She said she had never seen the color again in all the years since. She said she had wondered sometimes if she had remembered it correctly, if time had made it more vivid than it really was. She looked at the row of blooms and then she said, I remembered it exactly right. By the end of September, the market column in Opaline's notebook read $614 in gross receipts. She subtracted everything: brush mower, seed garlic fencing, hardware pullets, feed market registration, the roll of hardware cloth for the coop. When she was done subtracting, she had $270 left in her account at First Cumberland Bank, more than she had started with in February after the $9 purchase. She wrote the number down twice, not because she doubted the arithmetic, because she wanted to look at it again. The zinnias she cut for market the last 2 Saturdays of September, a dozen stems each time, and sold everyone. Thessaly Wickham, the market manager, stopped at the table the second time and said simply that she had never seen that color at this market before. Opaline said she had not seen it anywhere before either. Thessaly told Opaline she had grown up in Harlan County, that her mother had been a woman who kept flowers the way other people kept financial records, carefully, with attention to what came back and what did not. and that when she was 8 years old, her mother had come home from an errand with a handful of zinnias she had gotten from a woman at a roadside. Just a woman standing by her mailbox with flowers. She said she had extra of that day. Her mother had pressed one of those flowers into a book. Thessaly still had the book. She said the color in that pressed flower, faded as it was after nearly 40 years, was the same color as the stems on Opaline's table. Opaline was quiet for a moment. She asked if the woman by the mailbox had given a name. Thessaly said she had not asked, but the road her mother had been driving was County Road 7. They stood in the October light at the edge of the market table with that information between them, and then Thessaly reached out and touched one of the stems, not to take it, just to confirm that it was real and present, and actually there. Opaline reached into the inside pocket of the barn coat. She had been carrying the seed envelope for weeks, the original one from Eunice's box, now refilled with seeds she had collected from the first blooms that had gone to head. She held it out. Thessaly took it with both hands carefully. Then she handed it back. "Keep it," Thessaly said. "Come back next season with more flowers, and we will talk about a permanent spot at the front of the market. That color sells itself." She walked back toward the market office without waiting for an answer, and Opaline put the envelope back in her pocket alongside the receipt from February and her grandfather's list. She drove home and sat at the table in her room and opened Eunice's notebook to the last page that had writing on it. The final entry dated September 14th, 1971. The handwriting was the same as the first entry 20 years earlier, still controlled, still precise, though the letters were slightly larger, as if Eunice's eyes had needed more room by then. The entry read, "Season finished. Northeast corner as reliable as ever. Seed saved. Good color this year. Better than last." That was the last thing Eunice had written in the notebook. Not a conclusion, not a goodbye. Just the record of a season finished and seed saved and a color that had been good and was getting better. Opaline read the entry 3 more times. Then she took out her own notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page and began recording the final numbers of her own first season, the same way, column by column, without sentiment. The showcase was held on October 21st, a Saturday at the county fairgrounds on US 421 south of town. Opaline arrived before 7 with the Dakota's heater blowing cold and her grandfather's coat buttoned to the collar. In the truck bed, she had a flat of garlic bulbs cured and wrapped in burlap, a mason jar holding dried zinnia heads arranged so the coral showed through the glass, and a 2-page production summary she had copied out the night before, every number from the season laid out in order. She also had Eunice's notebook. It had been in her coat pocket for most of the fall, and she had simply not taken it out when she dressed that morning. She set up her table in the agricultural annex and set the notebook down next to the garlic without thinking about it, and then she looked at it sitting there and left it where it was. Hubert Fugate came around to each table with his clipboard and his Harlan County Co-op cap, and the unhurried manner of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that the important things were usually quieter than the unimportant ones. He reached Opaline's table and looked at the garlic and the summary and asked his questions and wrote things down. Then he saw the notebook. He did not pick it up. He looked at Opaline and asked what it was. She told him it had belonged to the woman who worked the land before her. He asked how far back it went. She said 1951 to 1971. He picked it up then with the deliberate care of someone who had handled old documents before. He turned to the first entry and stood at her table reading without speaking for nearly 4 minutes. Then he carried the notebook to the 2 other members of the panel. They came back together. Fugate asked if she had found the drainage infrastructure on the western edge. She said she had found it in late March. He nodded the way a person nods when something has been confirmed that they already suspected. He said the notebook was one of the finer pieces of farm documentation he had seen in 30 years of extension work. He said whoever Eunice Vestal had been, she had understood her land at a level that most growers never reach, and she had had the discipline to write it down, and that combination was rarer than people assumed. The young grower recognition was a small maple plaque about the size of a hardback book with her name engraved in block letters and the name of the showcase and the year below it. Fugate handed it to her himself and shook her hand with both of his. She thanked him. She put the plaque under her arm and the notebook back in her pocket and began breaking down her table. It was while she was carrying the empty garlic flat to the truck that she saw Garnett. He was at a table on the far side of the annex, a display of greenhouse produce from his operation large in uniform. He did not see her immediately, but when she was halfway across the floor, he looked up and his eyes went to the plaque under her arm and something moved across his face. She kept walking. He intercepted her at the exit. He did not raise his voice. He stepped into her path and said quietly enough that only she could hear, Small ground like that, one good season is not a business. You know that. She stopped. She looked at him for a moment. At the space just past him, the doorway and the morning light beyond it, and the parking lot where her truck was waiting. Then she said, "You knew that drainage system was there before I ever set foot on that property." He did not answer. She said, "Eunice Vestal designed it, built it, and maintained it for 20 years. Hubert Fugate just called her records some of the best farm documentation he has seen in 30 years of extension work. That system runs from her land, my land, and it has been doing its work on your parcel for 40 years without your name on any part of what built it." She was not raising her voice either. She said it the way Eunice had written things down plainly without decoration as a statement of what was true. She said, "I am not selling. I am not going anywhere. And you have been standing on the wrong side of this since before I was born." Garnett looked at her with the expression of a man who had run his calculation forward and arrived at a number he had not wanted to see. He did not respond. After a moment, he stepped out of her path, and she walked through the door and into the October morning and did not look back. Thessaly Wickham was standing near the door and had heard the last part. She did not say anything when Opaline passed. She just nodded once, the kind of nod that contains a full sentence. Opaline loaded the truck and drove home. They came the next morning. She heard the truck before she saw it. The particular diesel sound of the Coalfield Farm ram on the gravel of County Road 7 moving slower than it usually moved. She was in the field pulling the last of the spent bean plants, working the northeast corner. The ground still dark and loose beneath her boots, and she kept working when she heard the engine because the beans needed finishing, and she had learned over the course of that year that the work did not pause for things that were going to happen regardless of whether she paused for them. Both of them got out, Sheldon and Theron. They stood at the fence line and looked at the rows. Neither of them spoke. Opaline finished her row and walked over. Sheldon came through the gate. He moved down the center path between the beds the way he moved through everything, with the deliberate economy of a man who did not waste motion, looking at the ground, not at her. He stopped at the northeast corner and crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the soil, the way he had learned to test ground before he was old enough to drive the way their grandfather had taught both of them on the same land. He held his fingers there for a moment. Then he stood back up and kept walking to the far end of the field and turned around and came back. He stopped at the gate. He looked at the plaque on the tailgate of the Dakota. What he said next, he said quietly, and because he said it quietly, it belongs only to the two of them, and she has not repeated it and will not. But she will say that he said it without any of the managerial calm he had used in the kitchen at Coalfield Farm the previous December, and that when he said it, he was not laying out options or describing facts or managing an outcome. He was just talking to his sister. She told him he was welcome to come back in the spring if he wanted to see the ground green. He nodded. He went back to the truck. Theron had stayed by the fence the entire time. He had not walked the field. He had not looked at the plaque. He had stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the hens move through the far corner of the lot in their slow morning circuit, and he had not looked at Opaline until Sheldon was already at the truck. When he did look at her, she understood something she had been carrying without knowing how to set down. There are things a person cannot say in a kitchen on a December morning when they are 24 years old, and their older brother is standing at the counter, and the whole architecture of what they have always known is reorganizing itself around a dead man's unrevised will. There are things that get swallowed because saying them would require standing against something enormous, and the person is not yet sure how to do that, and so they say something smaller and worse. Something like, "Do you need money for gas?" And they go back inside and they carry that ever after. She could see it in his face. She had been carrying it too, the weight of that moment in the parking lot of Coalfield Farm, the question that had not been a question, and the answer she had given, and the silence that had followed for months. She had not known until this moment that he had been carrying it the same way. She gave him a small nod. Not forgiveness exactly, not the resolution of anything complicated, just the acknowledgement that she had seen him, that she saw him now that the door was not closed. He looked down at the ground. Then he walked back to the truck and they drove out the way they had come, slow on the gravel, and she stood at the fence and watched them go until the sound of the engine faded into the ridge. She stood there a while after they left. The morning was clear and cold in the way October mornings are. In that part of Kentucky, the light coming in flat and precise across the ridgeline, the mountains present the way they are always present, steady and without promise and without judgment. The rows behind her were straight. The northeast corner was dark and loose and smelled of everything that had been building there since before she was born. Since before her grandfather had sat at Ondine's fence line, and talked about a woman named Eunice Vestal and a piece of ground on County Road 7 that was worth more than anyone looking at it from the road would ever know. She reached into the inside pocket of the barn coat and took out the 3 pieces of paper she had been carrying all year. The receipt from the February auction creased soft from being folded and unfolded many times. The seed envelope, now holding her own, saved seed from the first season, the year written on the outside in marker. And her grandfather's list, the penciled items he had never gotten to finish, the 2 lines at the bottom that had brought her here. She read them one more time. Ask Ondine about the land east of the culvert. Watch Garnett. He had known. He had known, and he had done what he could with the time he had left. He had talked to Ondine. He had talked to Emmeline Pollard. He had sealed nothing in any box himself, had written nothing into any legal document, but he had planted the right words in the right people and trusted that the chain would hold. He had given her his coat and his truck and a list, and at the bottom of the list he had left her a door, and she had walked through it. She folded the papers together and put them back in the pocket. She thought about Eunice then, about a woman who had worked this same corner of ground for 20 years, who had built a drainage system no one else could see, and tended a color of flower. No one else had, who had eventually folded both the knowledge and the seed into a box and locked it and left it in the dark on a flat stone and trusted it to time, who had not known who would find it or when, who had only known that the ground would still be there and that eventually the right person would come. Opaline had come. She had come with $9 and a truck with 200,000 miles and a coat with a torn lining and a notebook from the dollar store. And she had found what Eunice left, and she had used it, and the ground had done the rest. The following spring, she would plant the garlic again in the northeast corner and put the zinnia seed in along the fence and start another tray of tomatoes on the windowsill. She would add a second water tank and extend the fencing along the south edge and look into what it would cost to run a small greenhouse through the winter, because Thessaly had mentioned it twice now, and Thessaly did not mention things without meaning them. She would keep the records the way Eunice had kept them, date and observation and results season by season without gaps. She would do all of that. But that was spring. For now she stood at the fence in the October light with the field behind her and the mountains above everything, and thought about what it meant to receive something from a person you never met, across 52 years of silence through a rubber gasket and a flat stone, and the particular darkness of a hand-dug cellar that had been waiting for exactly as long as it needed to wait. There is a word for that kind of transmission, the passing of knowledge and care and intention from one set of hands to another across the distance of years and death. But it is not the kind of word that gets used often enough to stay sharp. It has something to do with trust, and something to do with patience, and something to do with the understanding that the work you do with your hands outlasts your hands if you do it carefully enough and leave it somewhere it will keep. Eunice had understood that. Opaline's grandfather had understood it too. And now, standing at the edge of 8/10 of an acre on County Road 7 in Harlan County, Kentucky, in the October of her 19th year, with dirt under her fingernails and a plaque under her arm and $270 in a bank account she had built from $9 in a seed catalog and an old woman's handwriting, Opaline Cord was beginning to understand it herself. She went back to the field. There were still bean plants to pull before the light changed. The ground was still there. It had always been there. It would be there tomorrow and the spring after and the season after that, doing what good ground does when someone pays attention to it. She worked until the afternoon went long and flat across the rows, and then she walked to the truck and put the broad fork in the bed where it had been since Ondine handed it over the fence post without ceremony back in February. And she drove back through town toward Miners Creek Road with the heater running warm for the first time all fall, a small mechanical grace she had not expected, and the plaque on the passenger seat catching the low light through the windshield. If you have found something like this in a barn, in a cellar, in a box, you almost did not open in the handwriting of someone who left before they could explain themselves properly, she would want to hear about it. She thinks there are more of these things in the world than anyone talks about. She thinks people have been leaving things for each other in the dark for as long as there have been people trusting the ground to hold, trusting that the right person would eventually come. She thinks that kind of faith deserves to be spoken of.